Let me introduce Professor McCormick. John McCormick is Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He's the author of Machiavelli and Democracy from Cambridge University Press and Carl Smith's Critique of Liberalism from Cambridge University Press as well, and Weber, Habermas, and Transformations of the European State. Please, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriele. It's a great honor to share a panel with you and with Professor Inglese. And it hasn't been said enough. I don't think we can thank our organizers enough, Fabio and Vittorio and Filippo and Tanya. Thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful occasion. I've made a slight change to my title, the title of my paper. It now reads as Machiavelli's Inglorious Tyrants, on Agathocles, Scipio, and Unmerited Glory. One of the enduring puzzles confronting readers of The Prince concerns Machiavelli's evaluation of Agathocles of Syracuse. Is Agathocles an exemplar of Machiavellian virtù or not? On the one hand, Machiavelli declares that Agathocles' criminal behavior cannot be deemed virtuous. On the other, the Florentine does just that, twice invoking the Sicilian's virtù. However ambiguous may be Machiavelli's evaluation of Agathocles' virtue, he declares unequivocally that Agathocles is not counted among history's quote-unquote most excellent men, and that while the Sicilian's actions may have gained him power, they do not earn him glory. There is, I believe, ample evidence to confirm that Machiavelli, in fact, considers Agathocles virtuous. Certainly just as virtuous, or even more so, than Cesare Borgia. Machiavelli attributes virtue to Borgia with very little hesitation, despite Borgia's own notoriously criminal behavior and his failure to achieve... Okay, I pass it down. Despite Borgia's own notoriously criminal behavior and his failure to achieve nearly as much politically as Agathocles. Today, however, I wish to raise the stakes posed by Machiavelli's depiction of the low-born but entrepreneurial and intrepid Agathocles. Machiavelli, I argue, does not merely establish Agathocles' credentials as a prince of equal or superior virtue to Borgia, a widely reviled papal bastard, petty lord, and brutal condottiero. More audaciously or insidiously, Machiavelli demonstrates that Agathocles is more worthy of glory than the Roman commander and statesman most enthusiastically celebrated by classical and humanist literary authorities, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Agathocles' superior instincts, intentions, and actions, Machiavelli insinuates, render him a more virtuous political exemplar than the Roman nobleman so lavishly praised by Polybius, Livy, and especially Petrarch for vanquishing Hannibal and the Carthaginian Republic in the Second Punic War. In The Prince, Machiavelli suggests that Scipio managed to gain glory despite his deficient virtue, because he permitted himself to be coddled, constrained, and eventually even undone by senatorial elites. Moreover, Scipio also exhibited scrupulous concern for the opinion of writers. Traditionally, senators confer honorific titles like Africanus upon victorious commanders and exemplary magistrates, and subsequently writers propagate the fame of such individuals throughout history. Agathocles, for his part, cares not a whit for either senates or writers. He cares only for himself and for the great mass of his own citizen soldiers. As a result, Machiavelli suggests, Agathocles wins neither a glorious title, such as Africanus, nor enduring fame, even though he accomplished first, and more impressively, the feat for which Scipio became eternally renowned. Agathocles invaded Africa to draw a menacing Carthaginian army away from his native city, and he imposed upon the Carthaginian Republic a truce that guaranteed the security of his patria. The opinions of senators and writers notwithstanding, then, the thoroughly plebeian and possibly illiterate Agathocles serves as Machiavelli's thoroughly more worthy candidate for quote-unquote worldly glory. Agathocles, scorned or ignored by previous writers, is, I suggest, not merely Machiavelli's model of an enlightened or benevolent tyrant. More provocatively, Agathocles serves as Machiavelli's exemplar of a civil prince. That is, Agathocles serves as a superior model for the role of defender cum reformer of republics. Agathocles between the Syracusan Senate and the Carthaginian Empire. In his account of the Sicilian's career, Machiavelli emphasizes Agathocles' poor and lowly origins. Yet he quickly demonstrates how, through cruelty, criminality, and military prowess, Agathocles rose from the son of a simple potter to become praetor, the chief magistrate of the Syracusan Republic. At this point, Machiavelli writes, Agathocles decided, quote, to become prince and to maintain with violence and without obligation to anyone else that which had been given to him by consent, unquote. Indeed, even supreme magistrates like Syracusan praetors and Roman consuls are bound by collegial obligations and are confined by finite terms of office. Agathocles aspires to a kind of rule that is, by contrast, completely or nearly unlimited. At the time, a Carthaginian army occupied much of Sicily and threatened Syracuse's security and independence. Machiavelli tells us that Agathocles informs the Carthaginian commander, Hamilcar, of his plans. But Machiavelli neglects to tell readers precisely what those plans are. Agathocles then calls a formal assembly of the Syracusan Senate and the people to decide important public matters, presumably hostilities with Carthage. At this public gathering, Agathocles orders his soldiers to kill, quote, all the senators and the richest of the people, unquote. In other words, in full sight of the popolo, Agathocles murders the wealthiest and most powerful citizens of his republic, collectively the social class that in the next chapter Machiavelli identifies as the great, the grandi. In so doing, Agathocles firmly establishes his principality in Syracuse. While Agathocles supposedly aspires to act in a manner unobliged or unbeholden to anyone else, he clearly depends on the consent of a foreign power. We may now surmise that Agathocles had asked Hamilcar to indulge or support his coup, in return for which Agathocles would offer Syracuse to Carthage as a client. Furthermore, Agathocles seems to assume the continued consent of common citizens, the people. Machiavelli reports that after perpetrating his crime against the Syracusan elite, Agathocles holds the principality, quote, without any civil controversy, unquote. That is, without any popular protestation. Indeed, once Agathocles betrays Hamilcar and refuses to surrender Syracuse's independence to Carthage, he withstands serious initial defeats and sieges without incurring popular revolts. Then, strikingly turning the besiegers into the besieged, Agathocles invades Africa and harasses the Carthaginians into accepting his peace terms. Specifically, he imposes upon them a truce that grants to him hegemony over the entire island of Sicily. In his summary of Agathocles' career, Machiavelli repeats the fact that he gained independence from virtually all others. While Agathocles initially depended upon the Senate's consent in order to wield supreme command, and upon Hamilcar's complicity to execute his coup, Agathocles' audacity and military skill eventually free him of such entanglements, both domestic and foreign. Machiavelli attributes Agathocles' military success first and foremost to his favor with the Syracusan soldiers, whom he gained for himself through many quote-unquote hardships and dangers. These words, disagi e pericoli, hardships and dangers, echo precisely those with which Machiavelli describes himself in the dedicatory letter. Machiavelli, after all, attempted to advance his own republic's security against foreign threats through diplomatic and military means. As you all know, he served as Florence's emissary to the empires that threatened his republic, those of France, Germany, and the Holy See. And he sought to recruit and train a Florentine civic military. However, the Florentine aristocracy consistently scuttled Machiavelli's efforts to better serve his patria. Florence's Grandi blocked Machiavelli's appointment as the Republic's ambassador to Germany, and they undermined his efforts to establish a large-scale citizen army within the city. Machiavelli often attributed to his own relatively humble origins the fact that he received so little cooperation, recognition, and reward from his fellow citizens for his difficult and dangerous service to the fatherland. Obviously, the hardships and dangers that, in Machiavelli's own words, link him with Agathocles produced greater results for the Sicilian. After rising to power through Syracuse's civic military and then personally removing any aristocratic obstruction to his plans, Agathocles greatly expanded his army's ranks. Conversely, Machiavelli, the citizen of an unarmed republic, acceded to the objections of his city's nobles and settled for the establishment of a smaller militia comprised of peasants from the Condato. Agathocles led the heavily armed Syracusans against fearsome Carthage to secure his city's independence on his own terms. The poorly armed Florentines sent emissaries like Machiavelli to effectively beg the great powers who besieged them to, pretty please, leave us alone. Agathocles' military acumen is unimpeachable. Yet Machiavelli also provides the Sicilian with a considerable domestic portfolio. Machiavelli notes that despite Agathocles', quote, infinite betrayals and cruelties, unquote, he remained securely in power for the duration of his long life. Most astoundingly, even while he left Syracuse to wage war on another continent. How is this possible? Agathocles' citizens, quote, never conspired against him, unquote, according to Machiavelli, because the Syracusan employed cruelties well used, specifically cruelties initially performed at a stroke, and cruelties that, when re-employed, subsequently result only in, quote, as much utility for subjects as possible, unquote. Agathocles' rapidly and surgically applied cruelties, Machiavelli avers, benefit rather than harm the majority of his people. In fact, in The Prince, Machiavelli upholds Agathocles as the chief example who proves the following somewhat paradoxical rule. A truly independent prince cannot live securely with his people unless they live in some security from him. Machiavelli insists, with Agathocles in mind, that, quote, one can never found oneself upon his subjects if, as a result of new and continual injuries, they are not safe against him, unquote. Notably, Machiavelli here uses the words subjects and citizens interchangeably. Depending on which classical sources were available to him, Machiavelli may have been aware of the following remark attributed to Agathocles. the Sicilian declared that he employed no bodyguards because the people themselves served as his bodyguard. If Agathocles was, as the writers so often called him, a tyrant, then Machiavelli seems to suggest that he is a peculiar kind of tyrant indeed. Agathocles, a republic's usurper or a civil prince? Again, despite Agathocles' remarkable effectiveness as a captain and as a prince, Machiavelli points to the simple fact that Agathocles is not, quote, celebrated among history's most excellent men, unquote. Machiavelli knows that writers of the past, historians, essayists, and philosophers, tended to denounce or ignore Agathocles. Machiavelli himself, quite famously, seems to hedge over Agathocles' status as a virtuous prince because the Sicilian violated norms pertaining to religion, compassion, faith, and friendship. Yet within the body of the prince, Machiavelli's own commitment to these qualities, which Agathocles may or may not possess, seems much more tenuous than is his commitment to cruelty well used, for which Agathocles serves as his principal exemplar. A more serious impropriety that Agathocles commits, an act that may indeed impeach the Sicilian's credentials as a fully virtuous prince, is the following crime. He, quote, killed fellow citizens, unquote, and in so doing overthrew a republic. From the pen of Machiavelli, who generally favors republics over principalities, this is potentially a very serious charge. Such criticisms of Agathocles abound in Cambridge School interpretations of Machiavelli, especially the work of Quentin Skinner. Today, I want to suggest that such criticisms are premised on the potentially faulty assumption that Machiavelli maintained a strictly undifferentiated notion of both republics and citizens. On the issue of republics, Machiavelli does not merely prefer republics to principalities. He favors certain republics over others, namely democratic republics like Rome, Athens, and the Swiss German cities over oligarchic ones like Sparta and Venice. Furthermore, Machiavelli may favor certain kinds of principalities over these latter oligarchic republics, especially principalities that convert unarmed republics into armed ones, and principalities that serve to transform republics governed by the few into those governed by the many. All of the ancient sources, whatever their conflicting accounts of Agathocles' career, concur on this, at least this one point. The Sicilian overthrew an oligarchic republic that had formerly been a democratic one. Relatedly, on the issue of citizens, Machiavelli begins to show in Chapter 8 and then confirms decisively in Chapter 9 that as far as he's concerned, there are two kinds, not one kind of citizen in a republic. As we all know, in Chapter 9, he distinguishes between the grandi, or the nobles, who are consumed by the appetite to oppress, and the popolo, the people, who are motivated by the appetite not to be oppressed. These distinctions among kinds of republics, between different kinds of principalities, and between diverse kinds of citizens must be considered in any serious evaluation of Agathocles. As many non-Cambridge scholars have noticed, Agathocles' reign in Syracuse, which Machiavelli describes with feigned ambivalence in Chapter 8, shares many characteristics with the civil principality that he describes with more explicit favor in Chapter 9. That is, a principality in which an individual comes to supreme power with the support of some citizens over others, most preferably, in Machiavelli's estimation, with the armed support of the common people against the nobles. In Chapter 9, however, Machiavelli somewhat curiously declares that he cannot provide details for how a civil prince, such as his example there, Nabis the Spartan, quote, successfully gained the people to himself and successfully withstood sieges by all of Greece and even by the Roman Republic, unquote. Perhaps Machiavelli need not explicate such means in chapter 9 because he has already provided precisely such details through the example of Agathocles in the previous chapter. In fact, if we consult the historical record, Nabis, Machiavelli's exemplar of the successful civil prince in chapter 9, behaves very much like Agathocles, the hesitantly praised subject of chapter 8. Like Agathocles, Nabis makes fighting subjects out of former slaves to expand Sparta's military forces. Like Agathocles, who revoked an unfavorable alliance with Carthage, Nabis betrays Macedonia to enhance his patria's security. Moreover, both princes, treated as petty tyrants by ancient writers, impose advantageous truces upon the two greatest military republics in history, respectively, Carthage and Rome. Finally, if, like Agathocles, Nabis did not murder his city's nobles at a stroke, Nabis does intermittently kill, torture, and exile his richest and most powerful subjects in order to distribute their wealth to the people. In short, both Agathocles and Nabis resort to cruelty and criminality to achieve their ends. Both usurp oligarchic republics by killing rich, prominent citizens. Both betray powerful military allies. And both successfully enlist their enlarged civil militaries to defend their fatherlands from external domination. If Machiavelli suggests that Agathocles shares with Nabis the qualities of a successful civil prince in chapter 9, he also demonstrates there that Agathocles, like Nabis, avoids the mistakes that he attributes to failed civil princes like the Gracchi and Giorgio Scali. The Roman and Florentine Grandi easily overcame, respectively, the Gracchi and Scali precisely because the latter had not militarily enlisted the people against the nobility. Machiavelli's juxtaposition, on the one hand, Nabis and Agathocles, with, on the other, Scali and the Gracchi, suggests that civil princes intent on reforming corrupt republics face a daunting and dangerous task. Put simply, civil princes who would reform republics that have become increasingly and deleteriously oligarchic encounter kill or be killed circumstances vis-a-vis the senates and richest citizens of their cities. Agathocles' actions, I submit, must be evaluated in light of this do-or-die dilemma. Agathocles must also be judged in light of the Machiavellian distinctions mentioned above, specifically between democratic and oligarchic republics, between princes who favor the people and those who favor the nobles, and between the opposing motivations of noble versus common citizens. From this perspective, there may be certain circumstances condoned by Machiavelli, such as those faced by Agathocles, where a prince might legitimately, quote-unquote, kill one's fellow citizens. This proposition will be important as we turn to the figure of Scipio Africanus. Scipio's unmerited glory in the prince. To reiterate, if Machiavelli equivocates over Agathocles' virtue, he much more adamantly declares that the Sicilian failed to win glory. One can acquire rule, imperio, through Agathocles' methods, Machiavelli concludes, but not glory. Cambridge scholars often use this remark regarding Agathocles' failure to win glory to diminish whatever virtue Machiavelli attributes to the Sicilian. However, within the pages of The Prince, glory does not unfailingly indicate Machiavelli's praise for individual princes. Machiavelli does not discuss glory as if it is something that he himself is freely capable of bestowing upon the princes he discusses. The writers, it seems, have already decided who is counted among the most excellent men and who is worthy of quote-unquote fame and glory. The writers have been the traditional arbiters of excellence, fame, and glory. However, as we know, because such writers do not properly apprehend the effectual truth of politics, as Vittorio reminds us, Machiavelli regularly and quite avowedly departs from their opinions. Perhaps not surprisingly, then, Machiavelli intimates that the writers often bestow glory upon individuals who don't actually deserve it. A notable example in The Prince is Ferdinand II of Spain. Another prominent case of an individual who inappropriately wins glory from the writers is Scipio Africanus. What would Machiavelli have expected readers of The Prince to know about Scipio? On the basis of Livy's Roman histories and Petrarch's epic poem, The Africa, they likely would have known at least 3 salient facts about Scipio. 1, he assumed military command at a remarkably early age, after his father and his uncle, incumbent Roman consuls, died fighting the Carthaginians in Spain. 2, Scipio earned the agnomen Africanus for invading Africa to draw Hannibal out of Italy and for vanquishing Carthage. Finally, 3, Scipio voluntarily exiled himself from Rome after prominent citizens accused him of wielding excessive political influence within the Republic. In The Prince, Machiavelli never specifically discusses Scipio's famous accomplishments. The Florentine notes that Scipio was indeed a rare example in his own lifetime and in recorded history, but not so much for any positive qualities that the Roman noble exhibited or for any heroic actions that he performed. Rather, Machiavelli finds Scipio remarkable because he managed to gain fame and glory despite serious personal deficiencies and notable public failures. First and foremost, Scipio serves as the negative exemplar of the fundamental Machiavellian lesson that love is an insufficient bond of obligation for commanding soldiers and ruling subjects. Machiavelli recounts how Scipio's ease and mercy encouraged his soldiers to revolt against his command, and it allowed an abusive military envoy to go unpunished. As a result of these incidents, Machiavelli reports how the vaunted Fabius Maximus denounced Scipio before the Senate as a corrupter of Roman military discipline and imperial rule. Machiavelli attributes Scipio's excessively affable ways not only to a fundamentally humane nature, but also to the fact that his personal disposition was reinforced by certain readings of books, in particular Xenophon's Education of Cyrus. Scipio imitated the qualities of Cyrus accentuated by Xenophon: chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality. And as a result, he lost control of his troops and misruled conquered subjects. By too literally following lessons provided by ancient writers, Machiavelli suggests Scipio underestimated the necessity of the kind of beneficent cruelty employed by other figures invoked throughout The Prince, notably Agathocles. Yet despite his early missteps, Machiavelli points out that Scipio manages to pursue a successful military and political career precisely because he lived, quote, under the government of the Senate, unquote. Senatorial expertise and authority compensated for Scipio's deficiently lax mode of proceeding. It bought Scipio valuable time so that he could change his ways before bringing ruin upon either himself or the Republic. Ultimately, Scipio's subjection to the tutelage of Rome's senators enabled him to recover from his mistakes and to win incomparable worldly glory. The Roman Senate, after all, eventually bestows upon Scipio the title Africanus, a title whose renown is spread by subsequent writers, very much like the ones to whom Scipio had already displayed profound deference. The writers, who are at least partly to blame for Scipio's early mistakes, posthumously reward him, but not Agathocles, as one of the most glorious military captains in history. In so doing, such writers absolve themselves of their own complicity in the young Scipio's poor command and rule. In fact, Machiavelli suggests, they exacerbate the problem by failing to praise Agathocles' cruel ways, and likewise by failing to instruct readers that Agathocles' methods are generally more effective than are those of Scipio. If at any moment in his career Agathocles had behaved in the humane fashion of Scipio, rather than through the cruelty and even crimes that writers attribute to him, the Sicilian undoubtedly would have failed to rise from abject origins to become praetor of Syracuse. Agathocles was, after all, a potter's son, and not the progeny of senators and consuls. It is therefore very unlikely that the leading men of the Syracusan Republic would have granted Agathocles multiple opportunities to command. Unlike Scipio, Agathocles, in order to rule and command well, neither requires nor desires the tutelage of his republic's senators. Indeed, he proves to be the one who quite dramatically teaches them a lesson. Through cruelty well used and the favor that this brought him with his citizen soldiers, who never rebel against Agathocles, Agathocles throws off senatorial authority and defeats Carthage without any senatorial aid other than their initial consent in his assuming command. However, in forsaking dependence on senators, by refusing, quite demonstrably, to live, quote, under the government of the Senate, unquote, Agathocles also deprives himself of the formal triumphs granted by senates that confer honorific titles like Africanus, titles and victories whose fame is spread among future generations by obsequious writers. To put matters simply, in The Prince, Machiavelli demonstrates that Agathocles is fully virtuous, but not glorious. Scipio is glorious, but not fully virtuous. As it happens, the virtues that Machiavelli attributes to Scipio, chastity, humanity, affability, and liberality, are in themselves, as we know, for Machiavelli, no virtues at all. Glory, unlike virtue, entails a substantive form of dependence, problematically at odds with the will to autonomy at the heart of Machiavellian virtue. To gain glory, at least traditionally, one must exhibit deference to both senators and writers, those who mete out praise and blame, respectively, in the present and in the eyes of posterity. 5 minutes. So I'll skip the last part of the paper. I then turn to Machiavelli's treatment of Scipio in the discourses and show there that at the surface of Machiavelli's account, Scipio, by deferring to senatorial criticism of him for his influence he gained by defeating the Carthaginians, his influence with the people, he exiles himself and therefore diffuses a civic crisis, perhaps a civil war, by removing himself from Rome. But I then point out from the perspective of chapters 8 and 9 in The Prince that there's an implicit criticism of Scipio by Machiavelli, that in some sense Scipio should have, like Nabis or Agathocles, become a civil prince and taken control of Rome and stem the tide of the corruption that was already starting after the end of the Punic Wars, the corruption that the agrarian laws only partly addressed, growing economic inequality resulting from empire, and the growing command of the increasing command and authority of individual generals. So I basically suggest that Machiavelli criticizes Scipio for remaining under the government of the Senate rather than, as Agathocles or Nabis, eliminating the Senate so as to revitalize his republic. So I'll just jump to my to my conclusion then now, which will take just a minute. So, if Scipio had elected to fully imitate not only Agathocles' military policy, but also his domestic one, then in all probability he would never have become our eternally glorious model of civic virtue. No writers, partial as they are to senatorial authority, would have been willing to spread his fame, except perhaps for Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli, after all, extols figures who decisively side with the people during the intractable social conflicts that inevitably beset republics. Figures like Agathocles, Nabis, and we might add Cleomenes and Hiero as well. Such individuals, to varying degrees, crush the nobles, redistribute their wealth to the people, and greatly expand the ranks of their civic military. The writers denounce such figures as, quote-unquote, tyrants, and Machiavelli does not object to such a designation in name. But tyrants who enrich and arm the people stand superior in the Florentines' estimation to those who emasculate and to one degree or another disarm them. Figures such as Appius Claudius, Sulla, Augustus, the Duke of Athens, and by insinuation, the Medici. Machiavelli is the writer who in his own unprecedented way glorifies the virtuous tyrant who despises senators and disregards writers. The tyrant who cares only about empowering the common people against their domestic antagonists and foreign oppressors. Such an individual is always both enabled and constrained by his subject citizens. Citizens who are armed and enjoy relatively equal socioeconomic status may rather easily convert a principality into a republic, especially when their quote-unquote tyrant fails to observe cruelty well used and resorts instead to cruelty as such. In point of fact, such an individual who empowers his people both civically and militarily is actually no tyrant, except, of course, in the eyes of nobles and writers. Machiavelli and the people understand him to be a civil prince, a republic's reformer, redeemer, or even refounder. On the 500th anniversary of this infamous Piccolo Libro, I declare with some confidence that such an individual warrants the name, not tyrant, but most purely and simply, Il Principe, the prince. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 10 minutes to discuss. Okay. 4 questions. Okay, Jean-Louis, sei il primo.
May I ask you my question in Italiano or in French? Italiano, ok. Grazie comunque per questa bella presentazione di un parallelo putarcheo tra Agathocles e Scipione. Per me c'è un problema fondamentale, che dico così, è che c'è un parallelo che c'è nel testo del Principe, nel capitolo 8, che non è il parallelo tra Agathocles e Scipione, ma è quello tra Agathocles e Oliverotto da Fermo. Quindi, se non sbaglio, lei non ci ha reso conto di questo, perché lui nel capitolo 8 sceglie questi 2 esempi, articola questi 2 esempi. Questa è la mia prima domanda. Seconda domanda, mi sembra che la critica di Scipione come esempio di capitano, tra virgolette, troppo dolce o troppo umano, vada a scontrarsi con una cosa machiavelliana fondamentale, ossia il fatto che il capitano deve essere amato dai soldati. Cioè l'amore dei soldati è una cosa fondamentale per la coesione della truppa, per la coesione dell'esercito. Quindi, ecco, che cosa ne facciamo di questo?
Thank you. Both excellent questions. The first question, one of the things I want to do in this... well, thank you. Sorry. I repeat, excellent questions. Thank you. I think there's always another paper, of course, right? So I have another paper with Agathocles and Livarotto, and I think that Machiavelli has I think Agathocles is the hub of a wheel that has many spokes that goes out in many different directions, and Livarotto is just the most proximate one. And I think the point of the Livarotto-Agathocles comparison is to show how the church in Italy forces someone who would conspire against a republic and reform it to do so through duplicitous means, much more duplicitous than Agathocles. So Livarotto has to become a mercenary. He has to go outside the city and become a mercenary captain, whereas Agathocles can rise as a potter's son through the civic military. So that's one. Two, the church, because of church papal politics and the reliance on mercenaries, politics occurs in secret rooms. So Livarotto lures his uncle and the first citizens of Fermo to a secret room and strangles them in private, whereas Agathocles virtuously, in front of the people, with the dignity, the dignitas that publicitas provides, can kill the senators and richest citizens in front of the people in a kind of virtuous civic act almost. So that's my understanding of the Livarotto-Agathocles comparison. But then I think there are many, many other comparisons, and this book project, I want to look at the implicit comparisons of Machiavelli's figures, not just the ones he pairs, but the ones that are implied without being explicit. And that's why the Scipio thing, I think that for Machiavelli, I think he assumed his readers whenever he would say, if he would say, here is someone who invaded Africa to fight the Carthaginians and liberate his patria, he doesn't have to say Scipio Africanus, because everybody will immediately know that is an implicit reference, so he doesn't have to employ it there. The second point, not just soldiers, I really want to, in the discourses, it's interesting how Machiavelli gives a non-military account of Scipio's career. It's much more focused on his civic career, and just as he, in a sense, he lost the faith of his soldiers as a young captain, as a young capitano, he then gained the faith of the people as a civic body. So he lost the control of the people as a military body, but he gained the control of the people in a civic body. But I've gone on too long, but grazie.
Eric, please. And then
Thank
Miguel.
you, John, for a wonderful and provocative paper. I have a quick question on Scipio.
Si.
So I think chapter 17, the representation of Scipio in chapter 17 goes directly supports your point. But in chapter 17, Scipio's mercy is contrasted with the cruelty, right? Presumably the well-used cruelty. But in chapter 14, Scipio is listed in a chapter that is about what the prince should do regarding the military. And there Scipio is listed as one of various excellent men who read the histories, right?
Yeah.
And so and the writers in chapter 14 are described as praising Philopoemen, Prince of the Achaeans, who, as he goes around the landscape, looks at every hill and thinks, how would a battle look here? So the writers here aren't just the ones that praise the nobles, but they presumably are functioning in an important way of showing what a prince should do regarding the military. So I'm just wondering, I always thought that the particular virtues that are praised in chapter 14 of Scipio are odd in this chapter, but does he really? How do you explain him being listed among the other?
Right.
Caesar and...
Well, it's a dubious list in a certain way, because as Peter will be surprised, I'm agreeing with him. Caesar is an ambiguous figure there, I think, as well. And I think it really relies on the open criticism of Scipio's reliance on Xenophon in the discourses, where he basically says Scipio makes all of these mistakes because he was following Xenophon what is Xenophon? He's not even a good reader. Like if you read Xenophon, you would know that this is rhetoric, the affability, the chastity, all of that. You have to read underneath that to see that Xenophon shows Cyrus's duplicity, all the kinds of things that Scipio doesn't engage in and has to kind of learn on the fly later on, for which he gives Scipio credit. And it's interesting, the contrast between Scipio in the Discourses and Scipio in the Prince is the implication is Scipio deserves glory. He may not be the most glorious, he may not deserve glory over Hannibal, but he deserves glory for what he accomplished. Whereas my reading here is that in the Prince, he really wants to say, Scipio is undeserving of glory in this company.
Thank you, Hib. And Miguel, I think Miguel was before. No? Okay. Filippo.
Thanks, John, for a great paper. How do you situate your reading of Agathocles of today vis-à-vis your more general previous interpretation of Machiavelli broadly? This is not the first time that you use the term democracy for Machiavelli, and you know very well that many wouldn't agree. Your book is called Machiavellian Democracy. And however, your previous interpretation, I feel, is very much focused on the institutional, if not constitutional, dimension, which is strikingly absent from today's reading, of course, because you go where you should go. I wonder if by bringing so strongly Agathocles into the picture, you're bringing back what is lacking in the Machiavellian democracy, namely the element of the Kratos over the demos. And you know I wrote this, reviewing your book. Thanks.
Yeah. No. It's meant to be complementary in a certain sense, because I mean, I don't elaborate in Machiavellian democracy, but I declare democratic republics require individual princes to, as Machiavelli says, to both found and reform them. And so in this project, the title of this book project is The People's Princes. So it focuses on these civil princes who either establish the kinds of institutions that you're talking about, or renew or bring new ones at points where republics become corrupt. And so so it's a focus on primarily drawing upon chapters 7, 8, 9 in the Prince, and more importantly, the understudied chapters of Discorsi 1, 16 through 19 in the Discourses, where basically the word civil principality is not used there, but what he's describing is behavior very much like Agathoclean behavior, Nabis's behavior, Cleomenes, basically reformers who realize, I mean, the subtext there, and we must always remember, socioeconomic matters are discussed very delicately by Machiavelli because of the legacy of the Ciompi Revolt. It's always a very subtextual issue. But basically, my understanding is the relationship of those chapters in the Prince and those chapters in the Discourses is that democratic republics will become more oligarchical over time. Inequality will expand, which will corrupt the republic. You need to reinstitute equality. The way you do that is through a reformer such as Agathocles or Nabis or Cleomenes, or what should have been done by the Gracchi if they had used the people militarily and not just legislatively, or Scipio if he had realized the position he was in, rather than abdicate, leave the city, actually become a civil prince of the city.
Thank you. A couple of more questions. 1, 2, 3, 4.
An observation and a question. The observation is in your use of Scipio, there is a kind of paradoxical aspect in being Scipio, in your interpretation, the champion of Republican values, and at the same time being one of the family who introduced Greek culture in Rome, and being considered the champion instead of those who were undermining Republican values. And the main thing, what I see in your presentation, is you are dealing actually with the role of intellectuals. You name them as writers, but the point is, which side are these intellectuals? And it seems you are just hinting to it. So I'd like you to state more clearly why you are, it seems to me, why you are saying that Machiavelli is, in a way, interrupting a tradition of writers that are on the side of the powerful.
No, that's exactly I thought I was intimating it more strongly. That I wasn't trying to be that subtle. I mean, I was hoping it came off more clearly. I think Machiavelli's chief criticism of the writers in their estimation of republics is they tend to prefer aristocratic republics over democratic republics. You know, that's the whole effort of the first several chapters of Book One of the Discorsi, is to convince those who think Sparta and Venice are, you know, the best models for a republic to know that actually Rome is the better model, even though you're afraid of it. These are the reasons why you should like Rome. And then also that their accounts of princes, what constitutes good princes. They praise people like Augustus when, in fact, they should be praising people like Agathocles, or they praise people like Scipio because he defers to the Senate. Isn't he wonderful? He's so wonderful. He's so virtuous. He's so self-abnegating. And then what happens? Scipio's abdication. Scipio secured agrarian reform for his soldiers who fought in Spain and in Africa, but the entire Roman citizen soldiery required agrarian reform, as we know, right? And he leaves the city without saying, you know, if Rome is to be reformed, then all the soldiers need these kinds of reforms that his grandsons, the Gracchi, would try to initiate in a fatefully way. So I think Machiavelli's saying that the writers are skewed on both republics and princes. They like the wrong kinds of princes and the wrong kinds of republics.
Banu.
John, thank you. Actually, my question follows directly. So I take it that this is not just about reading Machiavelli's seemingly contradictory accounts of Agathocles and Scipio, but really through that showing his critique of the previous tradition of historians and writers' misguided conceptions of glory and virtue. So my question is this: what does your reading of Machiavelli, which I find extremely convincing, how does it configure Machiavelli's relationship to the enterprise of philosophy? What then emerges from this account that works through the very complexity of history and all of these examples? What does that say, and the previous historians before him, what does that say about Machiavelli's practice of philosophy?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Banu. I think it is indicative of what Machiavelli means when he says he's the first. He's departing from the ways of all the writers. I think it is chiefly in his way of, well, he says explicitly in 158 of the Discorsi, I view the people differently than all the other writers have. So I view their capacities, their judgment, their humor, their disposition. I judge that differently, and the job of, I wouldn't use philosophy, but I'll defer to you. And my philosophy is how to incorporate all of those popular elements properly into a republic. And that's why I think at the end of Book One of the Discorsi, when he's talking about the young who must be what was great about Rome was it incorporated the young into politics. And the chapter starts by talking about young commanders, young nobles like Pompey and Scipio, but then it soon says it's the plebeians. The Romans integrated the plebeians into politics and through the military and into a civic military relationship. And Machiavelli saying, I'm really the first to accentuate the popular side of that rather than the aristocratic side of that. And the other major thing is that history is moved by, the people can only do so much, and the kinds of princes who are necessary to provide and reform institutions that benefit everybody, that benefit the people, are precisely the kinds of tyrants that the writers have hated. Because the writers have been patronized by the aristocracy, they hate those tyrants who kill the nobles and redistribute their wealth to the people, or arm the people. Those are the tyrants, and you get, the idea that, for instance, the Gracchi, if you look in Cicero, his criticisms of the Gracchi outstrip his criticisms of Sulla. Sulla gets a pat, like the pro-aristocratic tyrant who's worse than anyone, unimaginable. And the Gracchi who fail and get murdered are, become the emblem of tyranny, and yet Sulla, we just won't talk about that. Let's blame Caesar, because he's a popolare, so we'll blame Caesar, and he went too far. So these are the kinds of ideologies of writing that Machiavelli is trying to, I think, completely turn around.
One last question.
Thank you very much, John, for your wonderful paper. I wanted to ask you, the prince is a very ambiguous figure it's a polysemic term, very polysemic term. There are actual princes who don't deserve to be, like the Medici, for example. There are those who are not princes but would deserve to be, like Machiavelli's young friends. There are also, the prince can also be, and very often is, an oligarchy, but also, and this is the link, in my view, that you could establish, you were not able to do it here, but perhaps you have thought about it, the multitude can also be a prince. It's very explicitly said in 158.
Yeah, and 2:2. Yeah.
So, would the connection between the kind of civil prince that you were portraying and democracy, couldn't this connection be drawn from the idea Machiavelli says when the multitude are a prince,
right,
and taking into account that the multitude is good, or the people is good at preserving, at conserving what
right,
the people led by a prince might have constructed.
Yeah.
So I think from the institutional point of view that Filippo was referring to, there I think there is a fundamental connection. And related to that, I cannot help, once again, refer to the contemporary situation and to the role of the intellectuals commented here. I wonder the extent to which we are not the epigons or the court humanists of Machiavelli's time. We flatter one way or another, with some critique, of course, the oligarchy. And the oligarchy that we endure today
right,
is a cannibal oligarchy, quite unheard of in history. So, isn't it part of a Machiavellian approach to attack the contemporary court humanist, of which Machiavelli's scholarship is quite full?
Yeah. Working your way backwards, the contemporary situation, I gave this paper at Duke University, which is in the American South. It's a very conservative institution. And after I gave the talk, the host said, "We didn't ask for a memorial lecture for Hugo Chavez." Well, maybe I should end on. I will end on that.